The blade catches firelight as it rises into the air. Blood drums in the ears of the man holding it. His brother kneels in the field below, head tilted upward, eyes wide with confusion rather than fear. The weapon descends. The ground drinks deep for the first time in history. The earth has never tasted human blood before this moment. It will never forget. This is not a battlefield. There are no armies here, no kingdoms clashing over trade routes or water rights. There are only two men in an empty field at the edge of the world. One brother kills the other, while their parents live close enough to hear the wind in the grain. The first murder happens in silence, except for the final breath. When it is finished, the killer stands alone under an indifferent sky and realizes that everything has changed. He has crossed a line that did not exist until he created it. The earth itself will testify against him. This is the story of Cain and Abel, the first sons, the first rivalry, the first act of violence between human beings. Before cities rose and armies marched, before laws were carved into stone or kings claimed divine right, two brothers walked the same ground, and only one walked away. What happened in that field would echo through every generation afterward. It would define what humans are capable of when jealousy burns hotter than reason. It would establish that murder leaves a stain nothing can wash away. The world they inhabited was unlike anything we can fully imagine. There were no roads cutting through wilderness, no villages clustering around wells, no smoke rising from distant cooking fires. The human population of the entire earth could gather in a single room. Every person alive knew every other person alive. There was no such thing as a stranger. There was no concept of distance great enough to escape your family. You were born into a web of relationships so tight that isolation was impossible. Everyone you would ever meet already knew your name. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten biblical history, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest of this story. We're just getting started. Adam and Eve had been expelled from the garden. That expulsion was not ancient history to their children. It was recent memory, a wound still fresh in the family story. Cain and Abel grew up hearing about a place they could never visit, a life their parents had lost through disobedience. They knew the names of the trees, the sound of the voice that walked in the garden in the cool of the day, the feel of soil that yielded fruit without thorns. And they knew it was gone, locked behind a flaming sword that turned in every direction, guarded by cherubim whose forms were too terrible to describe in detail. Their parents had been cast out into a world that resisted them. The ground outside the garden did not cooperate. It grew thorns and thistles with enthusiasm, but yielded food only through sweat and persistence. Adam, who had once named animals and tended paradise, now broke his back, coaxing grain from reluctant earth. Eve, who had walked with the divine, now birthed children in agony and raised them in a world shadowed by death. Everything was harder than it should have been. The earth itself seemed to push back against human hands. Into this world came Cain, the firstborn, the first human being born rather than created. Eve looked at him after the ordeal of birth and declared she had brought forth a man with the help of the Lord. There was triumph in that statement, defiance even. She had been told she would bear children in pain, and she had. She had been cast out of paradise, and she had survived. Now she held proof that humanity would continue despite everything. Cain was both burden and promise. He arrived screaming into a world that had never heard a baby cry. We do not know how long Cain was an only child. Months, perhaps years, long enough to be the center of his parents' universe, the sole focus of their hopes and fears. He was the only child in the world. Every parent's gaze fell on him. Every conversation included him. Every plan for the future depended on him. Then Abel arrived, and Cain was no longer singular. Abel, the second son. His name in Hebrew carries the meaning of breath, vapor, something transient and insubstantial. Whether his parents sensed something about him, or whether the name was simply chosen without prophetic weight, we cannot know. But the name would prove fitting in the most tragic way. Abel's life would be brief as breath, gone before it seemed to have fully begun. The brothers grew. The biblical text gives us almost nothing about their childhood, no stories of games played or lessons learned. No mention of who taught them to walk or speak. The narrative has no interest in those details. It moves with cold efficiency from birth to occupation. Cain became a worker of the ground. Abel became a keeper of sheep. Those two facts contain the seeds of everything that follows. Cain took after his father. He bent his back to the soil, wrestling food from earth that fought him at every turn. He knew the frustration of seeds that refused to sprout, of rain that came too late or too hard, of grain stalks that grew thin and pale, no matter how much care he gave them. Working the ground outside Eden was a form of combat. Every harvest was a small victory against a creation that had been cursed because of his parents' choice. The ground beneath Cain's fingernails was not the rich, dark soil of paradise. It was dust that clung and dirt that resisted. Abel chose a different path. He kept flocks. He followed sheep and goats through scrubland, finding water and grass, protecting the vulnerable animals from predators that prowled the margins of the human world. His work was mobile, where Cain's was fixed. His labor depended on nurture and guidance rather than force. He watched for signs of sickness in the flock, defended lambs from whatever hunters existed in that primordial landscape, and knew each animal by sight and temperament. We must be careful not to impose later symbolism too quickly. The ancient readers of this text would have understood that both occupations were legitimate and necessary. Farming and herding were the twin pillars of settled human life. Communities needed grain and meat, crops and livestock. Neither brother had chosen a superior path simply by profession. Both were doing what humans had to do to survive in a world east of Eden. But the text records what happened next with devastating brevity. In the course of time, both brothers brought offerings to the Lord. Cain brought fruit of the ground. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, specifically their fat portions. The Lord regarded Abel and his offering, but he did not regard Cain and his offering. That single line has generated centuries of interpretation. Why was one offering accepted and the other rejected? The text does not explicitly say, and that silence has troubled readers since the words were first written. Some traditions suggest Cain's offering was inferior, that he brought leftover produce rather than first fruits, while Abel brought the best of his flock. The text supports this reading by noting Abel's offering came from the firstborn and included the fat portions, the choicest parts. Nothing similar is said of Cain's produce. Perhaps he brought whatever was convenient rather than what was costly. Other interpreters point to the difference in the offerings themselves. Abel shed blood. His offering required the death of an animal, a lamb from his flock. Blood flowed into the ground as smoke rose to the sky. Cain's offering was bloodless, the produce of his labor but not the life of a creature. In a world already marked by death, where animals had been killed to make garments for Adam and Eve after their expulsion, perhaps blood sacrifice carried meaning that grain could not. Perhaps the lesson was already being established, that without the shedding of blood, there would be no covering for human guilt. Still others suggest the issue was not the offering itself, but the heart of the one offering. Faith expressed itself in Abel's action. He gave with reverence and awareness of what he was doing. Cain went through motions, performing an obligation without devotion. The external act was similar, but the internal posture was different. God, who sees what humans cannot, perceived the difference. Whatever the reason, the result was clear. Abel's smoke rose straight to heaven. Cain's did not. Whether by visible sign or inner knowledge, both brothers understood that one offering had been accepted and the other had not. Abel received approval. Cain received silence. The rejection struck Cain like a physical blow. His face fell. The Hebrew phrase suggests more than disappointment. It describes a collapse of countenance, a darkening of expression, a visible manifestation of rage and shame. Cain's whole posture changed. The anger was not hidden or controlled. It showed on his face for anyone to see. In a world where the only witnesses were his family, there was no hiding his reaction. And then God spoke to him. This is remarkable. The Lord addressed Cain directly, asked him questions, warned him. The divine voice that had walked in Eden, that had pronounced judgment on Adam and Eve, now spoke to their son. The conversation was not punishment, it was intervention. Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. The words were both diagnosis and warning. God identified the emotion twisting inside Cain and offered him a path forward. If you do the right thing, you will be lifted up. Acceptance is still possible. This is not permanent rejection. You have a choice in what happens next. But the warning that followed was darker. Sin is not an abstract concept in this moment. It is personified as a predator, crouching like a beast outside a door, waiting for opportunity. It has desire. It wants to master you. Your task is to master it instead. This is the first time the word sin appears in Scripture, not as broken law or theological category, but as a living threat. Something with intent and hunger, something that can be resisted or surrendered to. Cain stood at a threshold. Behind one door was reconciliation, obedience, acceptance. Behind the other was the beast that crouched in shadow. God told him plainly which door to choose. But God did not choose for him. Cain said nothing in response. The text records no reply, no argument, no question. His silence is more terrible than any words could be. He did not ask why his offering had been rejected. He did not plead for instruction on how to do better. He did not repent, or humble himself, or acknowledge the warning he had just received. He simply heard the words and then turned away from them. What happened in Cain's mind in the space between that divine warning and what came next? We can only imagine the spiral, the sense of injustice, the burning conviction that he had been wronged. Abel had done nothing special, nothing Cain could not have done, yet Abel had favor. Abel stood in the light while Cain stood in shadow. It was not fair, it was not right, and the presence of Abel, alive and approved, was a constant reminder of Cain's failure. As long as Abel existed, Cain would be the rejected one. As long as Abel breathed, the comparison would stand. The logic of murder formed in the mind of a man who had never seen death between humans. He had no category for what he was contemplating. There were no laws against it because the act had never occurred. There were no consequences he could imagine because no precedent existed. He was inventing something new and terrible, and he was doing it while standing in a field under heaven with the divine warning still echoing in his ears. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. The text records this but does not include the words. Some ancient manuscripts add, "Let us go out to the field," suggesting premeditation and planning. Others leave the speech unspecified, a blank space in the narrative. Either way, the brothers went out together to the field, away from their parents, away from shelter, into open ground where there were no witnesses except the earth itself. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. The text does not describe the method. No weapon is named. No detail of violence is given. The murder is stated as fact, stark and irreversible. One moment there were two brothers. The next moment there was one brother and one corpse. The first human being to die was killed by his own brother. Death entered the human family not through old age or accident or disease, but through deliberate violence born of jealousy. The ground drank Abel's blood. The same earth that had resisted Cain's farming now received something it had never tasted: human blood soaking into dust, the stains spreading in the dirt, the body lying still in the field where moments before both brothers had stood alive. Cain looked at what he had done. He had solved his problem. Abel would never again stand as contrast to his rejection. The favored son was silenced forever. But the silence did not last. The Lord spoke again. This time the question was simple and devastating. "Where is Abel your brother?" God knew the answer. The question was not for information, but for confession, an opportunity for Cain to acknowledge what he had done. The same pattern that had played out with Adam and Eve in the garden was repeating with their son in the field. A question designed to prompt honesty, a moment when truth could still be told. Cain's response has become proverbial for evasion and defiance. "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" The lie came easily. The sarcasm dripped from the second sentence. He threw God's question back as mockery. Was it his job to track Abel's movements? Was he responsible for a grown man? The words were crafted to deflect, but they revealed everything. Cain knew exactly where Abel was. Abel was in the field where Cain had left him. But Cain would not say it. He would not confess. Even confronted by God directly, he chose denial. The divine response came not as question, but as accusation. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." The earth itself was testifying. The blood that soaked into the dust had found voice. It cried out, not in words, but in presence, an accusation that could not be silenced or buried. The ground had received the blood, and now bore witness to the crime. Cain might refuse to speak the truth, but creation itself would tell what happened. The first murder had not gone unnoticed. Heaven had heard everything. But something else was stirring in that moment, something that would reshape Cain's entire future. Abel learned to read the land in a way his brother never could. Where Cain saw soil as something to be broken and conquered, Abel saw the wilderness as a living thing that spoke in the language of wind and starlight. His flocks moved with the seasons across the foothills beyond Eden. He walked behind them in silence, staff in hand, watching their shadows lengthen across stone. The sheep knew his voice. When predators came in the night, when the ground trembled, when storms gathered on the horizon, they pressed close to him. He slept among them on hillsides, where the grass grew thin and silver. His hands grew calloused from pulling lambs from thorn bushes, from binding wounds, from carrying the weak ones across his shoulders through the dark. He spent weeks away from the settlement, away from the sound of his brother's iron tools striking stone. Out there in the high pastures, the air was thinner. The stars seemed closer. The silence was so complete that Abel could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the breathing of the earth itself. It was in that silence that he first heard the voice. Not audible, not spoken aloud, but undeniable. A presence that filled the emptiness around him like light fills a room. The same presence his parents spoke of with trembling voices, the presence they had walked with in the cool of the day before the gates closed behind them forever. Abel did not speak of this to anyone. Not to his mother, who would weep, not to his father, who would grow distant and silent, certainly not to Cain, who would mock him, or worse, who would claim his own visions, his own encounters, his own favor. But the encounters continued. In the pre-dawn cold, in the heat of afternoon when the sky turned white, in the moments between waking and sleep, a nearness without form, a knowing without words, Abel began to understand that worship was not performance or negotiation. It was response. It was the only honest answer to a presence that required nothing and offered everything. Cain noticed his brother's silences growing longer, the way Abel's eyes seemed focused on something beyond the visible horizon. the way he moved through the world as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. It infuriated him. The first harvest after the settlement was established came in the 7th year after Eden. 7 years of Cain dragging water from the river, of fighting weeds that grew faster than his crops, of watching insects devour entire rows of young grain. 7 years of blistered hands and a back that never stopped aching. But the harvest was good, better than good. The grain stood golden and heavy in the fields he had carved from wilderness. The fruit trees he had planted were laden with figs and pomegranates. The melons were sweet, the lentils abundant, the olive trees finally beginning to bear. Adam walked through the fields with him, silent, nodding. Eve wept when she saw the abundance. Cain felt something like vindication rising in his chest. He had done this. His hands, his will, his refusal to accept that the ground was cursed. He had bent the earth to his purpose, and it had yielded. The offering was his mother's idea, though she would later wish she had never spoken the words. She told her sons the story again, the story they had heard since childhood but never fully understood, how their father, in the garden, had been clothed by God himself after the disobedience, how blood had been shed for the first time in creation, how an animal had died so that their parents' shame could be covered. "The ground drinks blood," Eve said quietly, staring at her worn hands. "It drank Abel's father's blood when God made the covering. Perhaps it hungers still." Adam said nothing, but his face went gray. Eve looked at her sons. "Perhaps we should bring offerings. Perhaps we should bring offerings. Perhaps we should bring offerings. What we have been given, even in exile." Cain seized on the idea immediately. An offering, a public demonstration of gratitude, a way to display the success of his fields, the fruit of his suffering, a way to show that he had not merely survived outside Eden, but had built something magnificent from cursed ground. Abel listened and said nothing. But that night, out among his flocks, he thought about blood and covering, about death and life, about what could and could not make things right between earth and heaven. The brothers prepared their offerings separately. Cain gathered the finest produce from his fields. He selected the largest heads of grain, the most perfectly formed fruits, the most impressive vegetables. He arranged them with aesthetic precision, creating a display that would have been magnificent in any temple, in any civilization, though no such temples yet existed on earth. He worked for days on the presentation. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to communicate the magnitude of his achievement, the quality of his work, the undeniable evidence of his favor with the land. Abel took a lamb from his flock, not the smallest, not a flawed animal offered grudgingly. He chose one of the firstborn, a ram without blemish, strong and healthy. He did not arrange it. He did not create a display. He simply prepared for what he knew was necessary. He understood, in a way his brother did not, that the offering was not about showing God what he had accomplished. It was about acknowledging what God had already done. The lamb would die in his place. Its blood would speak when his words could not. The day they brought their offerings was clear and windless. The sky was the pale blue of morning, endless and empty. The entire family gathered at the stone altar Adam had built years before, a rough structure of rocks piled waist-high in the open space between the settlement and the fields. Cain came first, carrying baskets of grain and fruit. He spread them on the altar with deliberate care, arranging each element for maximum visual impact. The colors were stunning against the gray stone: golden grain, purple figs, red pomegranates, green melons. The abundance of Eden itself, recreated by human hands from cursed soil. He stepped back, satisfaction warming his chest. His father nodded slowly. His mother smiled through tears. This was the proof. This was the answer to every doubt, every whispered fear, that they were abandoned. that they were beyond reach, that the ground would never yield to them again. Abel came forward quietly. He carried the lamb in his arms. The animal was calm, trusting, its head resting against Abel's shoulder. There was no ceremony, no arrangement, no display. Abel laid the lamb on the altar. He drew the blade across its throat in one swift motion. The blood poured out onto the stone, ran down the sides, soaked into the ground beneath. The lamb shuddered once and was still. The silence that followed was absolute. Then fire fell from heaven. Not metaphor, not symbol, not interpretation added by later generations trying to make sense of ancient words. Fire, actual consuming flame from empty sky. It fell on Abel's altar like a bird of prey, like lightning, like the breath of God made visible. The fire consumed the lamb completely, flesh and bone and blood. The flames burned white and gold, colors that had no earthly source. They made no smoke, they made no sound. They simply burned until nothing remained but ash and the smell of something holy. Cain's altar sat untouched. The fruit gleamed in the morning light. The grain rustled softly in a breeze that had just begun to stir, but no fire came. The sky remained empty above his offering. The stone remained cold beneath it. Everyone stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to speak. Eve's hand went to her mouth. Adam's face was unreadable, carved from stone. Cain stared at the two altars. His mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. There had to be a mistake, some misunderstanding, some technical failure in his presentation. Perhaps if he rearranged the offering, perhaps if he added more, perhaps if he prayed differently, spoke different words, performed different rituals. But he knew, deep in his bones, in the place where truth cannot be avoided, he knew. His offering had been rejected. Abel stood with his head bowed, trembling, not from pride, from terror. He had not expected this, had not presumed, had simply done what seemed right, what seemed necessary, what the voice in the silence had taught him to understand. Cain turned and walked away without speaking. His footsteps were carefully measured, his breathing controlled. He did not run, he did not shout. He simply walked back to his fields, back to the rows of grain he had planted with his own bleeding hands, back to the evidence of his worthiness that God himself had apparently failed to notice. His family did not follow him. They stood beside the altars, beside the ash and the untouched fruit, and they did not know what to say. For 3 days Cain worked in his fields with mechanical precision. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He pulled weeds that did not exist, straightened rows that were already straight, inspected plants that needed no inspection. His mother brought him food, and he let it sit untouched until she took it away again. His mind circled the same thoughts endlessly, a trap with no exit. He had done everything right. Everything. He had mastered the cursed ground, had brought life from death, had created abundance from nothing. He had worked harder, sacrificed more, achieved greater results than anyone in the history of the world, which admittedly was brief, but still. And Abel had done what? Walked behind stupid animals eating grass, let them breed according to their nature, killed one and burned it. No skill involved, no intelligence required, no transformation of the material world, just blood and death and divine favoritism. The injustice of it was suffocating. It pressed down on Cain's chest like a physical weight. His hands shook when he tried to work. His vision blurred and refocused. A ringing started in his ears that would not stop. On the 4th day the voice came to him, not the voice his brother heard, the voice of presence and nearness and light. This voice was different. It came from inside his own head, or perhaps from the ground beneath his feet, or perhaps from the air around him that had grown heavy and thick. The voice asked him a question. Why are you angry? Cain froze between the rows of grain. He had been angry his entire life, angry at a world that refused to cooperate, angry at parents who mourned a garden instead of celebrating a son, angry at circumstances and fate and the injustice of being born outside Eden for crimes he did not commit. But this anger was different. It was not the hot rage of frustration. It was cold, calculated, clarifying. It was the anger of someone who has finally understood the fundamental unfairness of existence and refuses to pretend anymore. "Why is your face downcast?" Cain touched his face. He had not realized he was crying. The tears were cold on his cheeks. When had he started crying? He wiped them away roughly, ashamed. "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Cain wanted to scream at it. He had done what was right. He had brought the best of his harvest, the finest of his work. What more could be asked? What impossible standard was he meant to achieve? But the voice was not finished. "But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Cain looked around wildly. There was nothing at his door, nothing crouching, nothing waiting. The fields were empty. The sky was empty. He was alone with his rejected offering and his unanswered questions, and his brother, who had done nothing to deserve favor and had received it anyway. Sin. The word was new. It had no precise meaning yet in human language, but Cain understood it instinctively, understood it in the way animals understand the scent of predators, the way prey understands the moment before the strike. Something was waiting, something patient and hungry, something that would devour him if he opened the door. He laughed bitterly. What door? What choice? The door had been opened the moment fire fell from heaven on his brother's altar and left his own untouched. The door had been opened the moment he was born outside Eden's gates, condemned to cursed ground and divine indifference. Cain went to find his brother. He found Abel in the high pastures where the grass grew thin and silver, where the air was cold even in daylight. His brother sat on a flat stone, watching the sheep graze below. His face was peaceful, untroubled, lit by late afternoon sun. The sight of that peace filled Cain with fresh rage. Abel had not earned that peace, had not worked for it, had not suffered for it, had not proven himself worthy of it. He simply possessed it, the way he possessed divine favor, the way he possessed everything Cain desperately wanted and could never reach. "Brother," Cain said quietly. Abel turned, smiled. "Cain, you came." There was genuine pleasure in his voice, genuine welcome. "Sit with me. Watch the light change. It's beautiful here when the sun sets." Cain sat. For a long moment they were silent, two brothers watching shadows lengthen across ancient hills. The sheep bleated softly below them. The wind moved through the grass like water. "I've been thinking," Cain said carefully, "about the offerings." Abel's smile faded slightly. "Yes. I don't understand. I brought my best, everything I had worked for, everything I had achieved. Why wasn't it enough?" Abel was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, without judgment. "I don't know, brother. I don't claim to understand God's ways. I only know that blood matters, that death matters, that we cannot approach holiness on our own terms." "But I worked harder than you," Cain said, and hated how his voice cracked. "I suffered more, I achieved more. By every measure, my offering was superior." "Perhaps that was the problem," Abel said softly. "Perhaps God was not measuring what we thought he was measuring." The words hung between them like a blade. Cain felt something snap inside his chest, some last restraint, some final barrier between thought and action. "Come," he said, standing abruptly. "Walk with me. There's something I want to show you in the lower fields." Abel stood, trusting, unsuspecting. Of course. They walked together down from the high pastures as the sun began to set. The sky turned gold, then orange, then deep red. Their shadows stretched out behind them, long and thin, like dark wings across the ground. Cain led his brother away from the settlement, away from their parents' dwelling, away from the flocks and the fields and the altar where fire had fallen from heaven. He led him to a place where the rocks were smooth and the ground was soft, where no one would hear, where no one would see. And the thing that had been crouching at his door finally came inside. The fields stretch silent under a sky that knows what is about to happen. Cain walks ahead, his back rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. Abel follows a few paces behind, still trusting, still believing that whatever tension has poisoned the air between them can be healed. The younger brother carries nothing but a shepherd's crook. He has spent his life walking behind flocks, guiding them away from danger, protecting them from predators. He does not recognize that he has become the prey. The ground beneath their feet is the same earth that gave up thorns and thistles when their father was cast from Eden. It drinks blood when wounded. It absorbs sweat and tears. Soon it will receive something it has never tasted before. Cain stops walking. Abel catches up, breathing slightly harder from the climb. They stand in a place without witnesses, without walls, without anyone who might intervene. The isolation is complete. No angelic guards patrol these borders. No voice calls out from the garden. The divine presence that once walked in the cool of the day among the trees is distant now, silent, waiting. Abel opens his mouth to speak. He never finishes the sentence. Cain turns with a stone in his hand, a rock pulled from the very ground that cursed his father, and he brings it down with all the force of his accumulated rage, his burning humiliation, his unbearable sense of cosmic injustice. The first blow strikes Abel's temple. The sound is wet and sharp, a crack that echoes across the empty landscape, like the breaking of something fundamental in the structure of creation itself. Abel staggers. His eyes widen, not with anger, but with shock, with the stunned incomprehension of someone whose reality has just shattered. He lifts one hand, not to defend himself, but reaching toward his brother, still trying to understand, still believing there must be some mistake, some terrible misunderstanding that can be corrected. Cain strikes again, and again. The stone comes down until Abel collapses to his knees, blood streaming from his head, soaking into his hair, running down his face. He tries to speak, but only blood comes from his mouth. His fingers claw at the dirt, searching for purchase, for stability, for something solid in a world that has suddenly become incomprehensible. Cain stands over him, chest heaving, the stone still gripped in his whitened fist. For one suspended moment he could stop. He could drop the stone. He could call for help. He could cradle his brother's head and beg forgiveness, and try desperately to undo what has been done. He does not stop. He brings the stone down until Abel stops moving, until the shepherd who spent his life protecting the helpless lies broken in the dirt, until the blood that once pulsed warm through veins and carried breath, and life soaks into the cursed ground and disappears. The first murder in human history is complete. Cain drops the stone. It lands beside his brother's body with a dull thud. His hands are red, his tunic is splattered with gore. He stands there breathing hard, staring down at what he has done, and the magnitude of it begins to register in his consciousness like the first tremors before an earthquake. Abel's eyes are open, staring at nothing. His mouth is slightly parted. His fingers are still curled in the dirt where he tried to hold on to life. The sheep he tended will wander lost tonight. The flocks he protected will bleat for a shepherd who will never come home. The silence that follows is absolute. No birds sing, no wind blows. The sky itself seems to hold its breath. Creation recoils from what has just occurred. Death has entered the world not through divine decree, not through natural causes, not through accident or disease, but through deliberate human violence. Brother has killed brother. The family that was supposed to repopulate the earth and restore what was lost in Eden has instead replicated the pattern of rebellion and destruction. The curse has deepened. Cain begins to move. His mind races through possibilities, through escape routes, through ways to hide what cannot be hidden. He looks around the empty landscape, calculating. No one saw. His parents were back at the settlement. No shepherd passed by on the road. No farmer worked nearby fields. In a world of only 4 human beings, he has managed to commit his crime in perfect isolation. He grabs Abel's feet and begins to drag the body toward a shallow depression in the ground, a natural ditch where rainwater collects. The earth is softer there. He can cover the corpse with dirt and stones, disguise what happened, pretend Abel wandered off and got lost in the wilderness, attacked perhaps by a wild animal, a lion or a bear. Abel's head lolls as the body drags across the ground, leaving a dark trail in the dust. Cain digs with his hands, scooping out earth, piling it to the side. His fingernails break. His palms blister. The same hands that once planted seeds now excavate the first grave in human history. He works frantically, glancing over his shoulder, expecting at any moment to see his father appear on the horizon, or his mother, or some divine messenger sent to stop him. No one comes. He rolls Abel's body into the depression and begins covering it with dirt. He piles stones on top. He scatters brush and dead branches to make the spot look natural, undisturbed. When he finishes, he stands back and examines his work. It is crude but sufficient. In a world without investigators, without forensic science, without anyone looking for evidence of a crime that has no precedent, it might work. He turns to leave. The voice stops him cold. "Where is Abel your brother?" The words do not come from any visible source. They simply exist in the air around him, pressing down with the weight of absolute authority. Cain recognizes the voice immediately. It is the same voice that spoke to him after his rejected offering, the same voice that gave his parents their sentence in Eden, the same voice that called light out of darkness and separated the waters from the dry land. There is nowhere to run. Cain forces his face into a mask of confusion, of innocence. "I do not know," he says. And even as the lie leaves his mouth, he can feel its inadequacy, its transparent falseness. But he presses on, adding the words that will echo through millennia as the archetypal response of those who refuse responsibility for their crimes. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The question hangs in the air, reverberating with layers of meaning Cain does not fully understand. Yes, the answer thunders back from the moral architecture of the universe itself. Yes, you are your brother's keeper. You are responsible for him. His safety was entrusted to you. The bond between brothers is sacred. The obligation to protect rather than harm those closest to you is foundational to everything that will follow. Cain has just violated the most basic law of human community. The voice speaks again, and this time there is something in the tone that makes Cain's blood freeze in his veins. "What have you done?" The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. The words shatter Cain's desperate hope that the crime could be hidden. There is no concealment possible. The blood itself has become a witness. The earth that absorbed it has become a prosecutor. The ground that Cain tried to use as a burial shroud has instead preserved the evidence, transformed it into an accusation that rises like smoke from a sacrifice, penetrating to the divine throne itself. Abel's blood speaks. The life that was stolen demands justice. The voice that was silenced by violence finds expression through the very substance that was spilled. In the cosmic courtroom, the victim testifies, not with words but with his shed blood, and no defense is possible against such testimony. Cain drops to his knees. The game is over. The lie has failed. There will be no escape through deception. The sentence comes swiftly. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. The curse extends beyond exile. It strikes at the very center of Cain's identity. He is a farmer, a tiller of the ground, someone whose entire sense of self is tied to cultivation, to making things grow, to coaxing life from soil. That identity is now revoked. The ground will no longer respond to his labor. It will refuse him. It will turn barren under his hands. Every seed he plants will fail. Every crop he tends will wither. The earth itself will remember what he did and reject him forever. More than that, he will become a wanderer, a fugitive, a man without home or community or stable place. In a world where human civilization is just beginning, where settlement and family and cultivation are the only defense against chaos and wilderness, this sentence is devastating. Cain will be cut off from everything that makes human life bearable. He will wander alone through hostile lands, always moving, never resting, never finding peace. The punishment mirrors the crime. He destroyed his brother's life, so his own life will become unlivable. He spilled blood into the ground, so the ground will refuse to sustain him. He broke the most fundamental human bond, so he will be cut off from human community forever. Cain's response reveals the depth of his corruption. He does not express remorse for Abel's death. He does not weep for his murdered brother. He does not beg forgiveness or plead for mercy on behalf of his victim. Instead, he thinks only of himself. "My punishment is greater than I can bear," he cries out. "You have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Even in his moment of judgment, Cain's primary concern is his own safety, his own survival. He fears vengeance. He fears that others will do to him what he did to Abel. In a profound irony, the man who showed no mercy now desperately wants mercy for himself. The man who murdered without hesitation now trembles at the thought of being murdered. But his fear reveals something else, something that has puzzled interpreters for thousands of years. Who exactly does Cain fear? In a world of only 3 remaining humans, Adam, Eve, and himself, who are these potential killers he worries about? Some scholars suggest Cain fears his own parents, imagines Adam tracking him down in rage and grief to execute justice for Abel's death. Others propose that by this point Adam and Eve had other children, additional sons and daughters mentioned only briefly in the genealogies, and Cain fears their vengeance. Still others see in Cain's words an intuitive understanding that the principle of blood vengeance he has established will follow him, that the violence he introduced into the world will multiply and eventually circle back to destroy him. Whatever the specific threat, Cain's fear is real. He knows that he has unleashed something terrible into human existence. Murder creates a debt that demands payment. Blood calls for blood. The law of retaliation that will later be codified as an eye for an eye, a life for a life, is already understood instinctively by the first murderer. The divine response is unexpected. Instead of abandoning Cain to the vengeance he fears, instead of allowing the cycle of violence to escalate immediately, the voice offers a strange form of protection. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him 7-fold. And then something even more mysterious occurs. The text says, "The Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him." The mark of Cain. No detail in the story has generated more speculation, more artistic interpretation, more theological controversy. What was the mark? A visible scar? A brand burned into his flesh? An alteration of his appearance? A supernatural aura visible only to those who might harm him? The text does not specify. It simply states that a mark was given, a sign that would protect Cain from being killed despite his crime. The mark serves multiple purposes. It protects Cain from immediate retribution, preventing the cycle of violence from spiraling out of control in the first generation of human history. It marks him as under divine judgment, a walking reminder of the consequences of murder, and it establishes a principle that will resonate through biblical law. Justice belongs to the divine, not to human vengeance. But the mark also creates a terrible paradox. Cain is protected from the very punishment his crime would seem to demand. He killed his brother, but will not be killed in return. He introduced murder into the world, but is shielded from being murdered himself. The grace extended to him is profound and troubling. It suggests that even the worst human crime does not place someone beyond the possibility of protection, that even the first murderer is not simply discarded, but carries a mark that declares his life still has some sacred value. This is not mercy in the sense of forgiveness. Cain remains cursed. He will still wander. The ground will still refuse him. His life will still be one of endless exile and restless movement, but he will live. He will survive. He will, impossibly, go on to build a city, to father children, to establish a lineage. The theological implications are staggering. If Cain deserves death but receives protection instead, what does that say about divine justice? If the first murderer is marked for preservation rather than destruction, what does that reveal about the nature of judgment and mercy in the moral universe? Cain rises from the ground. The conversation is over. The sentence has been pronounced. The mark has been given. He takes one last look at the spot where his brother lies buried under dirt and stones, and then he turns his back on the only home he has ever known. He walks east, away from Eden, away from the land where his parents settled after their exile, away from the flaming sword and the cherubim and any remaining proximity to the divine presence. The text says he went to dwell in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The name Nod comes from the Hebrew root meaning to wander. He goes to live in the land of wandering, the place of restless movement, the geography of exile. Behind him, the ground soaks up his brother's blood. The first grave in human history lies unmarked, except by the stones Cain piled in his desperate attempt at concealment. No monument stands over Abel. No ritual mourning marks his passing. He simply disappears from the narrative, erased by violence, remembered only by the blood that cries out from the earth. When Adam and Eve realize what has happened, the grief is unimaginable. They have already lost one son to murder and another to exile. The family that was supposed to heal the wound of Eden has instead deepened it. The next generation that was supposed to restore what was lost has instead multiplied the curse. Eve, who bore children in pain as part of her sentence, now learns that the greatest pain of motherhood is not in birth but in loss, not in the physical agony of labor, but in the spiritual agony of burying a murdered child and watching another walk away into permanent exile. Adam, who was tasked with filling the earth and subduing it, sees his family torn apart before civilization even begins. The first father is also the first man to bury his son, the first to know the grief of violence within his own household, the first to watch one child destroy another. The ancient world understood the magnitude of this catastrophe in ways modern readers sometimes miss. Family was everything. Blood ties were sacred. The bond between brothers was considered inviolable. Cities and kingdoms rose and fell based on the strength of family alliances. Dynasties were built on the foundation of brothers working together, protecting each other, extending the power of the household across generations. Cain and Abel's story established the opposite pattern. Instead of brotherhood leading to strength, it led to destruction. Instead of family creating security, it produced the ultimate vulnerability. The people closest to you, the ones who shared your parents and your upbringing and your history, could become your murderers. This realization echoes through every culture that followed. Greek tragedy is built on the horror of family violence, of parents killing children, and children killing parents, and siblings destroying each other. Roman history is soaked in the blood of brothers who murdered each other for thrones and power. The royal families of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Israel, Judah, and every ancient kingdom are littered with the corpses of relatives, killed by relatives, in the endless struggle for supremacy. But Cain and Abel's story stands at the origin of this pattern. It is the archetypal family murder, the original fratricide, the template for every brother who will raise his hand against his brother throughout all of human history. Archaeological evidence confirms how deeply this story penetrated ancient consciousness. Cylinder seals from Mesopotamia depict scenes of conflict between brothers. Egyptian tomb paintings show siblings divided by rivalry and violence. Ritual texts from across the ancient Near East include prayers for protection against the jealousy and hatred of one's own family members. The story also establishes the theology of blood. Abel's blood crying out from the ground becomes a recurring image throughout biblical literature. Blood has a voice. Life has testimony. Violence leaves evidence that cannot be erased. This concept will shape Israelite law, which forbids the consumption of blood because the life is in the blood. It will define murder as a crime, not just against the victim, but against the divine image in which humans are made. It will require cities of refuge, where those accused of killing can flee from blood vengeance while their case is judged. But in this moment, in the aftermath of the first murder, none of those legal structures exist yet. There is only blood in the ground, a body covered with stones, a mark on a murderer's forehead, and parents weeping in a broken household east of Eden. The catastrophe is complete. The impossible has occurred. Brother has killed brother. The first family has shattered. Violence has entered human experience, not through external threat, but through internal corruption. The enemy is not outside the gates. The enemy is already inside, sharing your meals, knowing your weaknesses, sleeping under your roof. Cain walks east, carrying his mark and his curse, and somewhere behind him, in the gathering darkness, the blood of Abel continues its silent testimony, crying out from the earth where it fell, demanding justice, bearing witness to a crime that can never be undone. But the story of that blood was only beginning to be written. Abel's blood soaked into the earth. The ground received it, absorbed it, and something changed in the fabric of creation itself. The field where Cain killed his brother became cursed ground, not by ritual, not by decree, but by the simple fact that innocent blood had been spilled there by a brother's hand. The first death in human history was not natural, not disease, not old age. It was murder, fratricide, the deliberate ending of a human life by another human being. Cain stood over the body, the rock still in his hand, Abel's blood on his clothes, his hands, his face. He had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the voice came, the same voice that had spoken to Adam in the garden, the same voice that would speak to patriarchs and prophets for thousands of years to come. Where is Abel your brother? The question was not asked because God needed information. It was asked because Cain needed to answer, needed to confess, needed to face what he had done. Cain's response has echoed through human history as the first great evasion of responsibility. I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? 7 words. 7 words that denied the foundational truth of human society, that we are responsible for one another, that we are bound to our family, that a brother's life is sacred, that we are indeed our brother's keeper. The voice came again, not angry, not shouting, but terrible in its clarity. What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. The imagery is visceral, haunting, blood that cries, blood that has a voice, blood that demands justice. In ancient Hebrew thought, blood represented life itself. To spill blood was to spill life, and life belonged to God. Cain had not just killed Abel, he had violated the divine image in which Abel was made. He had destroyed something that was not his to destroy. The curse that followed was specific, deliberate, tied directly to the crime. And now you are cursed from the ground which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain the farmer would no longer be able to farm. The ground would reject him, refuse to give him its fruit. He who had killed in a field would be exiled from fields forever. The earth itself would testify against him. Every harvest season, every planting, every seed that failed to grow, the land would remember what happened there. Cain's response to the sentence reveals something profound about the human capacity for self-pity, even in the face of terrible guilt. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. He did not protest his innocence, did not claim the sentence was unjust. But neither did he express remorse for Abel. His concern was entirely for himself, his suffering, his future, his fear. The first murderer was afraid of being murdered. But even in judgment there was mercy. God placed a mark on Cain, not as punishment but as protection, a sign that whoever killed Cain would suffer vengeance sevenfold. The mark ensured that Cain would live, would wander, would carry the weight of what he had done for the rest of his life. Death would have been easier. Execution would have been simpler. Instead, Cain was sentenced to live with his crime, to carry Abel's memory, to be known forever as the first killer. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The name means wandering, the land of wandering. Even in settlement, Cain remained a wanderer. He married, built a city, had children. His descendants became musicians, metal workers, livestock herders. Civilization continued, but it continued under the shadow of that first murder, under the knowledge that human beings were capable of killing their own blood. The story does not tell us what happened to Abel's body. Ancient tradition holds that Adam and Eve buried him, that they learned what death meant by the death of their son, that they mourned him as parents have mourned murdered children ever since. The grief of loss, combined with the horror of knowing that one child killed another. Eve would later give birth to another son, Seth. His name means appointed or granted. She said God had appointed another seed in place of Abel whom Cain killed. Life continued. The human race survived, but it survived knowing what it was capable of. The field where Abel died became part of human memory. The story was told around fires, passed from generation to generation, remembered, preserved, written down eventually in the text that would become the Hebrew Bible. Why did this story endure? Because it is the first story of nearly every story that would follow. The first jealousy, the first anger, the first murder, the first lie, the first evasion of responsibility, the first exile, the first fear of revenge. Every element that would define human conflict for thousands of years is present here in concentrated form. Ancient Near Eastern literature is filled with stories of brothers in conflict, but none with this stark simplicity, this psychological depth, this moral clarity about the nature of guilt and judgment. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains no story like this. Egyptian creation myths describe cosmic battles but not fratricidal murder among the first humans. Greek mythology would later give us stories of brothers at war, Romulus and Remus, Polynices and Eteocles. But those stories came centuries after the oral traditions behind Genesis were already circulating among Hebrew communities. The Cain and Abel narrative appears to reflect deep social memory about the transition from nomadic pastoral life to settled agricultural civilization, the conflict between farmers and herders, between those who settled and those who moved, between cultivation and sacrifice. The story preserves in mythic form the tensions that existed in the ancient Near East between competing ways of life. Archaeological evidence from the Neolithic period shows that the shift to agriculture around 10 to 12,000 years ago was accompanied by increasing violence. Skeletal remains show higher rates of trauma. Fortified settlements appear. Weapons designed not for hunting but for war become common. The move to farming brought population density, property disputes, competition for resources, and with those came conflict. The story of Cain and Abel may preserve folk memory of that transition, the knowledge that civilization came with a cost, that settled life brought new forms of violence, that brothers who once cooperated now competed. The field represents property, land, territory, things worth killing for. But the story operates on a level deeper than social history. It deals with fundamental questions about human nature. Why do we kill? What makes a person capable of murder? How do we deal with guilt? What is justice? What is mercy? How do we live in a world where violence exists? The Jewish interpretive tradition spent thousands of years exploring these questions through the lens of Cain and Abel. Rabbinic texts suggest that Cain and Abel were not just offering sacrifices, but establishing theological principles about worship, about intention versus ritual, about the heart versus the hand. The Midrash proposes that they were arguing over who would inherit the world, over land and property, over a woman, over God himself. The rabbis understood that the story contained multiple layers, that it could be read as theology, as sociology, as psychology, as moral philosophy. Early Christian interpretation saw Abel as a type of Christ, the innocent victim, the righteous one killed by the wicked, his blood crying from the ground, anticipated the blood of Christ, which would speak a better word than the blood of Abel. Where Abel's blood cried for vengeance, Christ's blood would cry for mercy. The New Testament letter to the Hebrews makes this connection explicit. Medieval Christian art depicted Cain and Abel endlessly. The sacrifice, the murder, the exile. Artists used the story to explore themes of divine favor and human jealousy, of sin and punishment, of the face hidden in shame and the face marked by God. Islamic tradition preserves the story with unique details. The Quran includes the narrative, with the addition that before the murder Abel told Cain that even if Cain attacked him, Abel would not fight back, that he feared God too much to kill his brother. This makes Abel's innocence even more pronounced, his righteousness even more complete. Islamic interpretation emphasizes Cain's remorse. A raven sent by God digs in the earth to show Cain how to bury his brother. Cain becomes remorseful, realizing the gravity of what he has done. The story continued to fascinate thinkers and writers through the centuries. John Milton, in Paradise Lost, described the murder in vivid detail, emphasizing the cosmic significance of the first death. Lord Byron wrote a dramatic poem called Cain, exploring the psychology of the first murderer, his resentment of God, his existential rebellion. Steinbeck structured East of Eden around the Cain and Abel story, using it as a framework for exploring generations of family conflict in California. The story endured because it named something true about humanity, that we are capable of terrible things, that jealousy can lead to violence, that anger unchecked becomes murder, that we will lie to God and ourselves about what we have done, that we both fear and deserve the consequences of our actions, that even in judgment there is mercy, that we must live with what we have done. Modern psychology recognizes the patterns described in the story: sibling rivalry, narcissistic rage, inability to accept disappointment, the murder of someone perceived as more favored. These are not ancient relics. They are contemporary realities. The story of Cain and Abel is reenacted in courtrooms and crime scenes across the world. Different names, different details. Same fundamental dynamic. Anthropologists note that fratricide exists in nearly every culture. Brothers killing brothers. The people who should be closest becoming enemies. Families torn apart by violence. The betrayal of blood bonds. Cain and Abel is the first recorded instance, but not the last. The story also raises questions that remain unresolved. Why did God accept Abel's offering and not Cain's? The text never explains. Jewish and Christian theologians have debated this for millennia. Was it the quality of the offering, the attitude of the worshiper, the sovereignty of God to choose as he wills? The text is silent, perhaps deliberately so, because the point is not why Abel was favored, but how Cain responded to not being favored. The point is what we do with disappointment, with rejection, with perceived injustice. Was Cain predestined to murder? Did God's rejection cause the crime? Ancient interpreters rejected this reading. Cain was warned. Given a chance to master the sin crouching at his door, he chose not to. The responsibility was his. Free will operated even in the first family, even when God knew what would happen. What happened to Cain's mark? Was it a physical sign? A brand? A divine protection that others could sense? A change in his appearance? The text does not say. Medieval artists depicted it as a horn on his forehead, as dark skin, as a permanent trembling, as a dog that followed him. These imaginative additions tried to make concrete what the text left mysterious. The mark functioned to protect Cain, but also to identify him, to ensure he would be known forever as the one who killed his brother. The archaeological search for historical Cain and Abel is of course impossible. These are figures from the primeval history. The opening chapters of Genesis function as mythology in the scholarly sense, not false stories but true stories, told in symbolic narrative form. Stories that convey meaning through metaphor and archetype, rather than through historical documentation. But the world described in the story reflects the ancient Near East, the sacrificial system, the agricultural life, the pastoral economy, the tribal justice system where blood vengeance was expected, the mark of protection to prevent that vengeance. These are elements drawn from real ancient cultures. The story was written down in its current form during the first millennium BC, but it preserves much older oral traditions, stories told and retold around fires, passed from parents to children, refined over centuries until they reach the literary form we have today. The simplicity of the narrative, the sparse dialogue, the vivid imagery, these are marks of oral composition, of a story meant to be remembered and repeated. The Hebrew text is a masterpiece of economy, 98 words in the original to describe the murder itself, no wasted words, no unnecessary description, just the essential elements, the brothers in the field, the rising up, the killing, the blood, the voice calling, the denial, the curse, the exile, everything needed and nothing more. This narrative efficiency is what made the story memorable, what allowed it to survive. Complex philosophical treatises get lost, simple, powerful stories endure. The field where Cain killed Abel became a symbol. Every act of violence between brothers, every betrayal of family, every murder committed in anger, every lie told to cover sin, every attempt to escape responsibility, all of these are called back to that first field, that first murder, that first blood crying from the ground. Human history has been shaped by Cain's question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Every society must answer, every generation must decide, are we responsible for one another? Do we have obligations to family, to community, to strangers, to those who have less, to those who need protection? The question remains open. The answer is tested constantly. When someone is murdered and witnesses say they did not want to get involved, they echo Cain. When a society ignores injustice because it does not affect them personally, they echo Cain. When people claim no responsibility for the suffering of others, they echo Cain. The question was asked at the beginning, and it has never stopped being asked. But there is another voice in the story, the voice of Abel's blood, crying from the ground, demanding justice, testifying to the truth. Blood that will not be silent, violence that will not be ignored, wrong that must be addressed. This too has shaped history. The cry for justice, the demand that wrongs be made right, that victims be remembered, that the dead be honored, that murder not go unpunished. Abel's blood began a tradition, the tradition of the innocent victim whose death cries out, whose memory demands response, whose life though ended still speaks. The martyrs throughout history, those killed for righteousness, those murdered for their faith, those slain for standing against evil, all of them echo Abel. Their blood joins his in crying from the ground, and the ground remembers, history remembers, God remembers. Cain lived, but he lived cursed, protected but marked, safe from death but not from the knowledge of what he had done. This too is part of the story's wisdom. Some punishments are worse than death, some guilts cannot be escaped, some memories cannot be forgotten. The murderer carries the victim with him forever. The story ends with Cain walking east, away from Eden, away from his family, away from the presence of God, wandering, always wandering, the first refugee, the first exile, the first person to carry the unbearable weight of what he had done. But even in that dark ending, there is a thread of mercy. God did not kill Cain, did not let others kill him, gave him protection, allowed him to live, to build, to continue. Justice was served, but the door to life was not closed. Cain would have descendants, would have a legacy beyond his crime. The mark that identified him as a murderer also identified him as one under divine protection. This strange combination of judgment and mercy defines the story. Cain deserved death but received exile, deserved execution but received a mark, deserved to be forgotten but became the most remembered murderer in human history. The field where Abel died has never been identified. No archaeological site claims to be the location. No ancient tradition fixes the place. The field exists everywhere. Every place where brother has killed brother. Every place where jealousy has turned to violence. Every place where blood has been spilled by those who should have protected each other. The field is in ancient Mesopotamia. It is in modern war zones. It is in city streets and rural farmlands. It is in homes where domestic violence erupts. It is in courts where family members testify against each other. It is wherever the most basic human bonds are broken by violence. Abel's blood still cries. The cry has not stopped. Every innocent victim joins the chorus. Every murder adds another voice. Every act of violence against the vulnerable echoes that first cry from the ground. And the question remains, what have you done? Where is your brother? Cain's answer remains unsatisfying. I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? The story insists the answer is yes. Yes, you are your brother's keeper. Yes, you are responsible. Yes, you have obligations. Yes, the blood cries out. Yes, the ground remembers. Yes, you will answer for what you have done. This is why the story was preserved, why it was written down, why it has been read for thousands of years, why it will continue to be read. Because it tells a truth about human nature that has never changed, that we are capable of killing what we should love, that jealousy can poison the heart, that anger can lead to irreversible action, that we will try to hide what we have done, that the truth will come out, that we cannot escape the consequences, that even in judgment there is mercy. The first murder shaped everything that came after, every legal code that prohibits killing, every moral system that values life, every religious tradition that calls murder sin. every culture that mourns the dead and demands justice for victims. All of these trace back to that field, that brother, that blood, that cry. Abel died, but his story lived. His innocence was remembered. His righteousness was honored. His blood spoke louder than Cain's lies. The victim became more famous than the killer, the murdered brother more remembered than the brother who murdered him. In this there is a kind of redemption, not for Abel who was dead, but for the rest of humanity, who learned from his death that innocent blood cries out, that murder will not be forgotten, that the first victim would not be the last, but that his story would stand for all who came after. The field is empty now, the blood long since absorbed into the earth, the brothers gone, the moment past, but the story remains. It remains as warning, as wisdom, as witness. It remains because humanity still needs to hear it, still needs to be reminded, still needs to face the question that was asked in the beginning and has never been answered fully. Where is your brother? What have you done? The ground still remembers, the blood still cries, and we are still our brother's keeper.